What's up guys, Asian here again with another video, and this is the first of a 5-part series aimed at newer players who want to know what it's like to run vet trials and how to get started with running those vet trials. So this particular video will cover what to expect from vet trials, from the guilds that run vet trials, and also how to best prepare yourself for vet trials. So this is a very kind of generic all-around video, not really anything specific to DPS, tanks, or healers. That will be in the next 3 videos where we'll be covering anything that's specific to DPS, healers, or tanks. And then finally, the 5th video is going to be those who have more experience in vet trials, who might want to lead their own group, or who might be asked to kind of develop the mechanics, develop strategies for their particular raid groups. So I'll be going over some advice for raid leading in that final video at the end of this series. So starting things off, first I do want to dispel a couple of myths and clear up some misconceptions about endgame PvE. The first and foremost being the notion that everybody who runs vet trials, everybody who runs endgame PvE are elitists or are toxic. Like any other community in really anywhere in the world, there are going to be some bad eggs. So there will be a couple of people, a handful of people who are toxic, who are elitists, who think they're better than everyone else. But a vast majority of players are actually quite helpful and very friendly, especially to newer and less experienced players. So if you think of it kind of from an endgame PvE perspective, there's really no reason for us to really quote-unquote gate this community. We want this community to grow. We want to see people get better, and we like to see these groups, sharing their excitement of getting their first VMOL clear and things like that. So there's really no reason for us to be, so toxic or elitist or anything like that. A lot of us just want the endgame community to grow and to thrive. So really, this whole idea that all of us are elitists or all of us are toxic and very unwelcoming to new players, that's pretty much a myth. Of course, you are going to have those couple of really bad people, but those are by far the vast minority of the endgame community there. So the next myth that I kind of want to talk about is the idea that it can be hard to get into a vet trials group. And this is, I don't know where this has stemmed from, but this does matter a little bit based on the type of group that you are looking for, what kind of content you're trying to run at. So there are a lot of guilds that run vet trials on a pretty casual basis. Maybe they run 1 vet trial a week or 2 vet trials a week, but they don't have like a set team or anything like that. And then there are guilds that progress through content and have a set team with set requirements. And then you have guilds like Mechanically Challenged, Hodor, Symbolic, Valor. Those guys are the ones that are pushing for leaderboard scores and things like that. So each of these different guilds have different sort of accessibility. So obviously the more casual guilds with no set team or any sort of like hard requirements that you have to meet, they're going to be easier to get into compared to progression guilds, which might have a dedicated team and have stricter requirements or higher requirements for their group members. So while it might not necessarily be difficult to get into vet trials guild, as you start to climb the kind of quote social ladder, is the best way for me to put it, of endgame PvE, it does get a little bit harder to kind of get into new guilds. That being said, though, a lot of endgame guilds, even the leaderboard guilds, do look for fills here and there. So if you manage to catch their eye or meet their requirements, then there is a chance that you might be able to break in towards those those very elite guilds, so to speak. And then one final more misconception than a myth that I kind of want to clear up is what actually counts as endgame PvE. So there's been a lot of discussion about what actually is considered endgame PvE. So a lot of people would say, oh, well, vet DLC hard mode dungeons are endgame PvE. Some people will just say vet trials in general. And there are even some players who say that only guilds that are going for leaderboard scores are considered true endgame PvEers. Ultimately, this is going to vary depending on each person, what kind of content you want to run, and at what level. So for the purposes of this video, I'll be discussing just vet trials in general and refer to those as endgame PvE content. So it does include guilds that push for leaderboard scores, but it also includes guilds that are progressing through maybe like Vet Maw or the Vet DLC trials, and it also includes more casual guilds who might just be running the Vet Craglorns once or twice a week. This also does include content like DSA and Black Rose Prison, but it does not include Maelstrom Arena, just because Maelstrom Arena is considered solo content, and we're going to be focusing in more on group content instead. So with all these sort of myths and misconceptions out of the way, let's first talk about the basics. So one of the first things you're going to want to have to decide when you kind of want to enter the endgame PvE community is what level that you want to run at, whether that's beginning or kind of looking further down the line where you want to end up. So generally speaking, there are 3 different levels of sort of guilds that you can join if you want to get into endgame PvE content. The first are what I like to call casual guilds. So these are guilds that might organize the vet trial run maybe once a week, maybe every other week, maybe twice a week, but they don't have a set team. They don't have any sort of very strict entry requirements for the guild or even for joining the vet trials run. They might just ask that you do a 20k 3 million dummy parts or something like that, but it's not like a hard rule or anything like that. So these are, as you can tell, they're more casual. They don't necessarily have a set team that progresses through content. They just want to go for clears. They want to have fun. They're not really concerned about optimizing their team or anything like that. They will have, though, an experienced member lead that particular trial for the night, and that member will explain the mechanics and strategies that they use to get through the trial. Now, again, this particular member might not be in a progression style guild or a leaderboard guild, so their strategies might not be the ones that the top end guilds are running. That might just be strategies that are used only within that guild, but nonetheless, these guilds are probably the best place to start getting some vet trial experience, because most of these guilds will typically only run the vet Craglorns, maybe the occasional foray into Asylum plus 0 or Cloud Rest plus 0, maybe even vet Maw here and there, but for the most part these guilds would typically run the vet Craglorn. So it's a very good place to kind of see where your build is at, how it performs in vet trials, and to get some experience behind like terminology and what to kind of generally expect from vet trials. The second step up are what are called progression style guilds. So these are guilds that usually have a set team, and they usually have set requirements in order to join their team or their guild in general. As the name suggests, these teams progress through content together, aiming for mostly clears, not necessarily scores or anything like that. They might be chasing NF after specific achievements. So for example, Mayflower is an example of what I'd like to call a achievement hunting guild. So we do progress through the hard content, but we also try to go for achievements, things like that. Our primary goal is not necessarily leaderboards, but it is instead to progress through content to get those achievements, not necessarily, again, to put up the best scores in the game. So that kind of separates this level of guild from what I like to call the leaderboard guilds, which we'll be talking about in a little bit here. So these guilds are definitely less common than the casual vet trials guild, and they're also typically hard to get into, mainly because once you're at this level of play, there is a preference for having a set team that you're running with every single time you're doing a vet trial. That's just for consistency's sake. It's a lot easier to progress through vet trials when you basically know the other 11 people you're going to be running with day in and day out. So it's a little bit harder to get into those guilds just because if they have their set team and nobody on that team is leaving for school or taking a break from the game, it is a little bit more difficult to get in. They also typically have higher set requirements just because to progress through the vet DLC trials, you will need higher DPS, you will need tanks and healers to have more meta sets. So in that regard, it is a little bit harder to get into just because of those harder requirements. Now, the final type of guild are typically the guilds that you see demonstrated most often on places like YouTube and Twitch, and those are the leaderboard guilds. So these are guilds that consist of basically the top players on their platforms, and as the name implies, they just shoot for leaderboard scores. So they shoot for world records, the highest scores, full vitality, things like that. So these are pretty much the cream of the crop when it comes to PvE endgame. These guys are basically the best in their roles, whether that's DPS, tanks, or healers, and these guys are often kind of setting the meta for everybody else who are doing the calculations, doing the experimentation required to kind of figure out what exactly is the meta. So these guilds definitely number less than a dozen on each platform. In fact, on PCNA there's probably less than half a dozen guilds that are considered leaderboard pushing guilds. So these are really hard to get into just because of the incredibly high requirements needed to kind of meet their expectations and things like that. But if you do get in, these guys are definitely the best of the best. So if you manage to get into one of these guilds, you can consider yourself one of the top players of ESO that way. So once you've decided at what level you want to play up, the next step is actually finding, the guild that plays at that level. So the best places to find a guild, from my experience, are either going to be through the ESO subreddit's Friday Find a Guild mega thread or the official forums. I've typically have had better luck on the official forums compared to the subreddit's mega thread, but your results may vary. So a lot of casual and progression style guilds will advertise there if they're having open recruitment. The leaderboard pushing guilds, you'll typically not be recruiting through the subreddit or the official forums. Typically speaking, those guilds will basically headhunt themselves, so they'll typically take a look at progression guilds. Maybe if you stream, they might watch your stream and basically offer you an invitation to not necessarily join the guild, but maybe be considered for a fill in case your main team has somebody who drops out or something like that. So if you are shooting for those leaderboard guilds, you're not going to be able to find them usually just by looking on the subreddit or looking on the official forums. They typically have either their own separate application process, or they headhunt, and they usually have closed recruitment process that way. A second way to find guilds is actually just through personal references, just asking around your other guilds. So maybe somebody in your trade guild runs vet trials with another guild every Friday night or something. You could ask that person, can I join in on a run on a Friday? I'm interested in doing vet trials. So that's one way you can kind of get your foot in the door, so to speak. Personal references do go a long way, just like they do in the real world. Having those connections does help out a little bit when it comes to getting into a guild. So for example, if you want to join a guild like Mayflower and you meet the requirements, it's beneficial if you have somebody in the guild who can vouch for your ability to perform, and so that way the raid league can kind of be more inclined to take you in as a fill if we need a fill for that night. So those are pretty much the best ways to find guilds. You can obviously go into zone chat, but very rarely will you find progression style guilds advertising or recruiting in zone chat, just because of those very strict requirements that we mentioned earlier. So once you get into a guild, make sure you get along with the people in the guild, particularly if it's an organized team that you're going to be raiding with day in and day out. You want raiding to be fun. You don't necessarily want it to be a slog. You don't want to necessarily have disagreements with your team. Again, this is a team environment. You have 11 other people who are basically relying on you, and having these disagreements can lead to larger issues down the line. I've personally have experienced this, where I've had disagreements with a couple of people on a team, and I did not decide to find a new group, and it ended up to leaving on bad terms. So you do just want to find a guild that fits you. So just find people who you get along with. Again, particularly if you're going to be raiding with them every single day. So with all that now said, let's say you found your guild and you have a couple of guilds in mind that you want to apply for. What's the next step? What can you expect from these guilds? So the first thing I want to talk about is time commitment, and that's mainly because that is a sticking point for me. So time commitment is going to vary depending on the guild and how many trials you want to run in a week. So as a personal example, I'm in 2 raiding guilds. So I'm in Hellfire Dominion and Mayflower, and I run for a total of 10 hours each week. So both of these guilds run raids twice a week for 2 hours a night. Then I also run a Black Rose Prison group with Mayflower on Tuesdays for another 2 hours. So from my experience, this is typically about average for a lot of people who run with organized groups, anywhere between 8 to 12 hours a night. Most guilds will be running 2 to 3 nights a week. We're running anywhere between 2 to 3 hours each night. So that's typically what you can expect to see. Leaderboard style guilds will be running more often, and as you get higher and higher up, there is a chance that you will be expected to commit more and more time. So for example, Nephis, who runs with Mundus, I believe, and Mundus and Valor, and I think he still runs with Sempiternal Way, he runs between 15 and 20 hours a week. Mechanical Challenge, for instance, based on their old raid schedule that I recall, they run anywhere between 16 to 20 hours a week. So it can become quite a large time commitment just on raiding itself. Ultimately, though, you can decide how much time you want to commit to vet trials. So, for example, since I'm a doctoral student, at some point I will need to step back a little bit. So I'll just, say I need to step back for a little bit and just basically maybe only run with 1 guild. So I only run 4 hours a week or something like that. So ultimately, it is up to you. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that this is just taking consideration only time spent in raids. This does not include time spent elsewhere on things like to perfect your build or perfect your rotation. So that's something else that you want to take in consideration. There will be time that you're going to need to spend in order to level your skills, perhaps, maybe level your CP, get more CP, farm any gear in case the meta changes or you need to get new gear, and just practicing your rotation. So all of these can end up eating more time away. So if you do want to join a vet trials guild, do take that in consideration, particularly if you're not already at max CP and you don't already have the gear farmed up. So beyond time commitments, there are obviously a couple more things that you should expect from each raid guild. So sticking to the kind of concept of time, timeliness is a very big factor. You want to make sure to be prepared to raid on time every night. So that includes not just being on Discord or being in a group, but also having your potions ready, having your food ready, having your gear ready, everything like that. It's really annoys people when you have one or two people who are late every night because they forgot to make potions the day before or something like that. So just make sure you're on time and ready to raid on your designated raid time. Second thing that you're going to want to kind of be ready for is kind of new experiences, new strategies, and just kind of be open and flexible in general. You'll be meeting a lot of different people, so obviously there's a lot of different personalities there, so you're going to want to be able to, develop your people skills to get along with everybody. And then each new group might actually do trials a little bit differently from another group that you might run with. So you kind of need to be flexible and open to kind of learning all these new strategies, learning all these methods of dealing with mechanics and things like that, as well as dealing with different types of people. So this is a very good chance for you to kind of develop and work on your people skills, so to speak, as well as, learn new strategies. So a lot of times you will be able to take these strategies and bring them to another guild if you're, struggling in one trial in this other guild. So definitely something to expect, just being able to be flexible on the fly there. Another thing that you can expect is to be able to communicate with your teammates. This should come as a given, but you'd be surprised at how many people actually don't realize this is incredibly important and actually don't realize that the lack of communication is actually really, really bad. So a lot of people assume that you're able to communicate via, the group chat, and that's not necessarily going to be the case. So you will need to find some way of communicating with people via voice. So you probably will need to download Discord or TeamSpeak if you're on PC. I believe consoles do have built-in group voice chat, but you will need to be able to talk to people, or at the very least listen to people. It's very helpful to be able to communicate problems that you might see in the guild in the run with your raid lead. So obviously you can do this during downtime via PMs, either in-game or on Discord or something like that, or you can just voice your concerns over the mic on Discord or TeamSpeak. So it's really important that you have good and clear communication. So that's something that is really key to success, especially in progression style guilds. One final thing that you kind of want to really watch out for, and this again should be a given, but a lot of people kind of don't really do this from my experience, is you are expected to, at the very least, not get worse, is the best way for me to put it. A lot of guilds will just take you in once you meet the requirements and typically won't retest if you're a DPS, for example. But that doesn't mean you should get lax. That doesn't mean that you should say, okay, I'm in a guild, I don't necessarily have to practice my rotation anymore. Each guild does have different expectations, but all of them do expect you to continue to meet the requirements, especially as they change from patch to patch. So for example, Hellfire Dominion, we've had to up our DPS over at least twice just because of the DPS increases that have occurred over each patch. So don't get complacent. Don't just sit there and expect to get carried. If you will be expected to at the very least maintain the amount of DPS that you're pulling, if not get it a little bit higher. So improvement is an expectation, especially in progression style guilds. It's less expected in casual guilds, but definitely is expected for progression style guilds. So other things that you might want to anticipate are obviously the guild requirements to join. So for DPS, this will usually consist of a DPS check on a dummy. A lot of guilds are shifting to 6 million dummy parses, whether they're self-buffed or you're given buffs from, the raid lead or an officer for your test. It kind of depends on each guild, but there will be a DPS check if you do intend on joining as a DPS. For support roles, this is a lot more varied, so it really depends on the specific guild. So for example, in Mayflower, you can't actually get in as a support role unless somebody in the guild acts as a reference and basically as a sponsor for you. In Hellfire Dominion, you can get into our open vet trials team by healing or tanking a vet DLC dungeon with an officer, but getting onto the progression team is really based on assessment by the raid lead, so basically me. So there's a lot of different ways to get in as a support role, but there's no one set rule that guilds typically go for. The only thing that is pretty much universal for support roles is having access to certain sets. So for healers, for example, it would be Olarime and IA, maybe Yorvolds as well. For tanks, it's definitely going to be Evan and Alkosh, maybe Plague Doctor or Torg or something like that. Each guild is going to have different set requirements, but that's typically the hard requirements for support roles. So moving on here, the other thing that you're going to want to expect, and this might rub people the wrong way, I know this has rubbed some people that I've talked to the wrong way, is that you need to be knowledgeable on the current meta. That doesn't necessarily mean you have to play at the meta, so you don't necessarily have to, for example, run Sororia and Spell Strategist as a Magicka DPS, for example, or Reliquin and Vancio Keda, for example, as a stamina DPS, but you do need to understand the meta, how it's formed, and what it actually consists of, especially as you start to rate at higher and higher levels. So for things like Vet Cragglone trials, you can get away with not running a meta build, just because those trials tend to be a little bit more forgiving. But as you get up into Vet Maw, Vet Halls of Fabrication, that's when you need to really know what the meta is like. So you don't necessarily need to be able to recite things like the damage calculation off the top of your head. You don't necessarily, again, need to run the absolute meta sets, but you need to be able to understand the meta, where it's coming from, and again, kind of tying back to the improving yourself, being able to improve yourself based on what you know off of the meta. For a lot of content, a lot of people will just say, as long as you meet the requirements, that's it. But if it makes content easier, there's no reason not to run the meta, is kind of the way that I view it for progression style guilds. And obviously for leaderboard guilds, they're just running the absolute meta because they're looking for pure optimization at that point. So that pretty much covers most of the generic stuff that comes to mind when you want to join vet trials, trying to kind of join the endgame PvE community. So each guild is going to be a little bit different. Each team is going to be a little bit different. So make sure to kind of look around, find one that fits with what you're looking for. Again, just because everybody's a little bit different, it's, I can't necessarily comment on each individual guild, but what I mentioned here today is stuff that you should keep in mind while you're looking for these guilds. So in our next video, we'll be discussing items that are going to be specific for DPS, and then again, we'll be going over for healers and tanks, and then one more for raid leads. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, leave them down in the comment section below. I will try to get back to them as soon as I can. Thanks for watching this video. Hope you guys found this informative, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.